And it is perhaps fitting that you have come together in Glasgow, once a heartland of the Industrial Revolution, but now a place to address climate change. This is a duty I'm especially happy to discharge, as the impact of the environment on human progress was a subject close to the heart of my dear late husband, Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh.
They finally opened Queen Elizabeth's burial vault, and what they discovered inside left the royal family speechless. Hidden for decades beneath the chapel floor, this secret chamber contained something nobody expected. When they lifted the heavy stone slab that fateful September night, even King Charles couldn't believe his eyes. What the cameras never showed you, what the palace desperately tried to keep quiet, is about to be revealed.
But for me, in the months since the death of my beloved Philip, I have drawn great comfort from the warmth and affection of the many tributes to his life and work, from around the country, the Commonwealth, and the world. His sense of service, intellectual curiosity, and capacity to squeeze fun out of any situation were all irrepressible.
Within the historic walls of Windsor Castle stands St. George's Chapel, a magnificent Gothic church that has served as the final resting place for English and British monarchs for centuries. The chapel's ancient stones have witnessed countless royal funerals, and beneath its ornate floor lies the Royal Vault, a subterranean chamber containing the coffins of numerous members of the royal family. By the mid-20th century, however, a problem had emerged that would require careful consideration and creative thinking. The chapel was simply running out of space. For Queen Elizabeth II, this shortage of burial space presented a deeply personal challenge. As the reigning monarch, she had to think not only about the traditions of the past, but also about the needs of her own family in the years to come. The existing burial arrangements were no longer sufficient, and something had to be done. This situation led to one of the most significant additions to St. George's Chapel in nearly 500 years, a project that would ultimately provide a final resting place for some of the most important figures in modern British royal history. The story of this addition begins with a deeply personal concern for the Queen. When her father, King George VI, died suddenly in February 1952, the nation mourned the loss of the monarch who had led Britain through the Second World War. His death came unexpectedly, and as a result, detailed funeral plans had not been prepared in advance. Following the state funeral, George VI's coffin was placed in the royal vault beneath St. George's Chapel. But this was intended only as a temporary arrangement. The problem was that no one had decided where the king should be permanently laid to rest. Years passed, and George VI's coffin remained in the royal vault, still adorned with the funeral wreaths that had been placed there during the initial ceremony. For the Queen and the Queen Mother, this situation was far from ideal. The vault was not designed as a permanent resting place with individual monuments or markers. It was essentially a holding area, and the thought of the late king remaining there indefinitely troubled his family greatly. The Queen wanted her father to have a proper, dignified burial place where the family could visit and pay their respects in a more intimate setting. In 1962, Queen Elizabeth II took action. She commissioned the construction of a new memorial chapel, a small addition to St. George's Chapel that would be dedicated to the memory of her father. The project was given to a team of architects who were tasked with creating something quite specific. The Queen had particular requirements for this new space. She wanted it to be able to accommodate the burials of 3 monarchs and their consorts, providing enough room for her father, herself, and potentially 1 future monarch. The Queen's private secretary communicated these wishes to the Dean of Windsor, emphasizing 2 key points. First and foremost, a specific and permanent resting place needed to be found for King George VI. Second, this resting place should be designed in a way that reflects modern sensibilities about royal burial practices. The Queen had strong feelings about how she wanted this to be handled, feelings that would shape the entire project. One of the most interesting aspects of this commission was what the Queen did not want. Throughout St. George's Chapel and Westminster Abbey, Many medieval and early modern monarchs are buried beneath elaborate marble tombs topped with lifelike stone effigies of the deceased. These monuments are often quite grand, showing the king or queen in full royal regalia, lying in peaceful repose. While these tombs are certainly impressive works of art and important historical artifacts, Queen Elizabeth II found them distasteful for modern use. She preferred a much simpler approach. Instead of commissioning an ornate tomb with an effigy, the Queen wanted her father and future occupants of the memorial chapel to be laid to rest beneath simple stone slabs set into the floor. These ledger stones would be engraved with the names and dates of the deceased, but nothing more elaborate. This preference reflected a more modest and understated approach to royal burial, one that emphasized dignity and simplicity over grand displays. The Queen also had another consideration in mind. She did not want her mother, the Queen Mother, to have to endure the emotional burden of burying her husband a second time. The process of moving George VI from the royal vault to a permanent tomb would inevitably be a difficult occasion, and the Queen hoped to have everything arranged and completed as quickly as possible. However, despite the urgency of these wishes, the project did not move forward immediately. 5 years passed before significant action was taken on the Queen's request. During this time, various proposals were considered and rejected. The challenge was considerable. St. George's Chapel is a protected historic building, and any addition to it would need to be carefully designed to complement the existing Gothic architecture. The architects had to create something that would blend seamlessly with a structure that had been built over 500 years earlier. The solution that was eventually approved involved constructing what is known as a chantry chapel, essentially a small extension attached to the exterior of the main chapel building. This would be the first architectural addition to St. George's Chapel in approximately 450 years, making it a significant undertaking both historically and practically. The design had to satisfy not only the royal family, but also architectural historians and preservation experts who were concerned about maintaining the integrity of the historic structure. Work finally began on the construction of what would be called the King George VI Memorial Chapel. The design that was approved created a small but elegant space that housed both a chapel area above ground and a burial chamber below. The above-ground chapel was fitted with an altar, and the architects incorporated a bronze relief depicting King George VI, ensuring that visitors to the chapel would have a visual reminder of the man for whom it was created. The construction took several years to complete, with work finally finishing in 1969. The entire project cost approximately £500,000 in today's money, a substantial sum that was paid for entirely by the royal family from their private funds, rather than from public taxation. This detail is worth noting because it demonstrates the personal nature of the project for Queen Elizabeth II. This was not a state-funded monument, but rather a private family memorial. Directly beneath the chapel floor, workers had constructed the burial chamber that the Queen had requested. This vault was designed to be accessed by removing the ledger stones set into the floor above, allowing coffins to be lowered into the space below. The chamber was sized to accommodate multiple burials, in keeping with the Queen's original vision of creating space for 3 monarchs and their consorts. With the construction complete, preparations began for the most important moment: the transfer of King George VI's remains from the royal vault to his new final resting place. On March 24, 1969, 17 years after his death, King George VI's coffin was finally moved. The ceremony marking this occasion took place a week later, and it was a private family affair rather than a grand state ceremony. Queen Elizabeth II attended, along with her mother, the Queen Mother, and Prince Philip. Their eldest children were also present, as were Knights of the Garter, the most senior order of British chivalry. The coffin was carefully removed from the royal vault, where it had rested for so long, and was brought into the new memorial chapel. From there, it was lowered into the burial chamber below. Once the coffin was in place, the ledger stone was positioned over the opening, and craftsmen engraved it with the essential details: the king's name, his date of birth, and the date of his death. The stone was simple and understated, exactly as Queen Elizabeth II had wanted. For the Queen Mother, This moment must have brought a complex mixture of emotions. After 17 years, her husband finally had a permanent resting place, a quiet chapel where she and her family could come to remember him in peace. The wait had been long, but the result was a dignified memorial that reflected the values of simplicity and respect that the Queen had wanted to establish. King George VI would remain undisturbed in his vault for many decades to come, the first occupant of a memorial chapel that would eventually house some of the most significant members of the modern royal family. The creation of this space solved an immediate problem for the Queen, but it also established a new tradition for royal burials, one that moved away from the elaborate tombs of the past and toward a more restrained and personal approach to memorializing Britain's monarchs. For more than 3 decades after King George VI was laid to rest in the memorial chapel, the vault remained undisturbed. The Queen Mother would visit the chapel to pay her respects to her late husband, and the space served its intended purpose as a quiet, dignified place of remembrance. However, in 2002, the memorial chapel would receive its next occupant under circumstances that no one had initially anticipated. Princess Margaret, the Queen's younger sister and the Countess of Snowdon, died in February 2002 at the age of 71. Her death marked a significant moment in royal history for several reasons, not least because of the unprecedented decision regarding her funeral arrangements. Princess Margaret became the first member of the senior royal family to be cremated, rather than buried in a traditional coffin. This was a notable departure from centuries of royal custom, and it raised questions about how and where her remains would be laid to rest. The decision to cremate Princess Margaret was unusual enough that it sparked considerable discussion at the time. Royal funerals had traditionally followed very specific protocols, and cremation simply was not part of those established practices. The funeral service itself took place at a crematorium, which was another break from tradition. Typically, senior members of the royal family would have their funeral services in major churches or cathedrals, followed by burial in a family vault or tomb. There are several theories about why cremation was chosen for Princess Margaret. One practical consideration that historians and royal observers have suggested relates directly to the King George VI Memorial Chapel. According to the original plans that Queen Elizabeth II had outlined, when commissioning the chapel, it was designed to hold 3 monarchs and their consorts. Princess Margaret was neither a monarch nor a consort, so technically speaking, there was no designated space for her in the memorial chapel's burial vault. However, cremation offered a solution to this space problem. An urn containing ashes takes up considerably less room than a full coffin, which meant that Margaret's remains could potentially be accommodated in the burial chamber alongside her father, without requiring the extensive space that a coffin would demand. Whether this was the primary motivation for choosing cremation remains a matter of speculation, but it certainly made the eventual placement of her remains more feasible. Interestingly, Princess Margaret's ashes were not immediately placed in the King George VI Memorial Chapel following her cremation. The process of opening the burial vault was complex and time-consuming, requiring the removal of the heavy ledger stone and careful preparation of the chamber below. Instead, her ashes were held elsewhere temporarily, waiting for a more appropriate moment for interment. That moment came just weeks later, when the Queen Mother herself passed away. Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, died on March 30th, 2002, at the remarkable age of 101. She had lived long enough to see her daughter celebrate 50 years on the throne, but she had also endured the sorrow of outliving her younger daughter by just 7 weeks. Her death meant that she would finally be reunited with her husband, King George VI, in the memorial chapel that her daughter, the Queen, had created for them decades earlier. The funeral of the Queen Mother was a major state occasion, reflecting her importance to the nation and the deep affection in which she was held by the British public. Following the funeral service, preparations were made for her interment in the King George VI Memorial Chapel. On April 9, 2002, the ledger stone that had marked King George VI's resting place for 33 years was carefully removed. The burial chamber was opened, revealing the coffin of the king below. The Queen Mother's coffin was then lowered into the vault to rest beside her husband. The two had been separated by death for 50 years, but now they were together again in their final resting place. It was during this interment that Princess Margaret's ashes were also placed in the burial chamber. The urn containing her remains was positioned next to the coffins of her parents, ensuring that the family was reunited in death. After the interment was complete, a new ledger stone was created to mark the burial site. This updated stone was engraved with both King George VI's details and those of the Queen Mother, noting their names and the dates of their births and deaths. However, Princess Margaret received her own separate memorial marker. In the right-hand corner of the chapel, a smaller stone was placed specifically for her, acknowledging her presence in the vault below. The inscription on Princess Margaret's memorial stone is particularly touching. It reads, "We thank thee, Lord, who by thy Spirit doth our faith restore. When we with worldly things commune and prayerless, close our door, we lose our precious gift, divine, to worship and adore. Then thou, our Savior, fill our hearts to love thee evermore." This religious verse reflects the spiritual aspect of the memorial chapel and provides a personal touch to Margaret's remembrance. The burial chamber of the King George VI Memorial Chapel would remain closed for another 19 years following these interments. During this time, Queen Elizabeth II continued her reign, eventually becoming the longest-serving British monarch in history. Her husband, Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, stood by her side for decades, supporting her through the challenges and triumphs of her long reign. However, in April 2021, Prince Philip died at the age of 99, just months short of his 100th birthday. Prince Philip's funeral took place during the restrictions of the global pandemic, making it a much smaller and more subdued affair than would normally have been the case for a senior royal. Following the funeral service at St. George's Chapel, his coffin was lowered into the traditional royal vault beneath the chapel floor. To many observers, this appeared to be his final resting place, and news reports at the time described it as such. However, this was not actually the plan. What many people did not realize at the time was that Prince Philip's placement in the royal vault was always intended to be temporary. The plan had long been established that when Queen Elizabeth II herself died, she and Prince Philip would be interred together in the King George VI Memorial Chapel. His coffin was therefore left in the royal vault, waiting for the day when he could be moved to join his wife in their permanent resting place. That day came on September 19, 2022, when Queen Elizabeth II died at Balmoral Castle in Scotland at the age of 96. Her death marked the end of an era, closing the chapter on a reign that had lasted 70 years. The state funeral that followed was one of the most watched events in television history, with millions of people around the world tuning in to pay their respects to the departed monarch. The funeral service took place at Westminster Abbey, after which the Queen's coffin was transported to Windsor Castle for a committal service at St. George's Chapel. During this service, the coffin was lowered into the royal vault, just as Prince Philip's had been. Many viewers watching the ceremony assumed that this was the Queen's final resting place, and news coverage at the time often described it as such. However, once again, the royal vault was serving only as a temporary location. What happened next was not broadcast or widely reported at the time. Later that same evening, hours after the public ceremonies had concluded, a private family service took place. Close members of the royal family were invited to gather at the King George VI Memorial Chapel. The chapel had been prepared for this moment, with the burial vault opened and ready to receive its final occupants. Prince Philip's coffin was brought from the royal vault, where it had rested for over a year, and was carried into the memorial chapel. There, it was carefully lowered into the burial chamber. Following this, Queen Elizabeth II's coffin was brought in and lowered to rest beside her husband. The two were finally together in their permanent resting place, in the chapel that the Queen herself had commissioned so many years earlier for her father. A new ledger stone was then installed. this time bearing the names and dates of all four principal occupants of the vault: King George VI and Queen Elizabeth the Queen Mother, and Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip. The stone is simple and dignified, continuing the tradition of understated memorials that Queen Elizabeth II had always preferred. Today, the King George VI Memorial Chapel contains 6 members of the royal family. King George VI and the Queen Mother lie together, as do Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip. Princess Margaret's ashes rest alongside her parents and sister. Yet despite these recent additions, the burial chamber is not completely full. According to the original design specifications that Queen Elizabeth II established when she commissioned the chapel, there is space for one more monarch and their consort. Royal observers and historians widely expect that this remaining space will be used for the current King Charles III and his wife, Queen Camilla. When their time comes, they will likely be interred in the memorial chapel alongside Charles's grandparents, parents, and aunt. This would fulfill the original vision of the chapel as a resting place for 3 monarchs and their consorts: George VI, Elizabeth II, and Charles III. However, this also means that future generations of the royal family will need to find alternative burial arrangements. Once King Charles III and Queen Camilla are laid to rest in the memorial chapel, it will be completely full, with no space remaining for additional burials. This presents a challenge that will need to be addressed in the coming years. One possibility that has been discussed is expanding the use of the royal burial ground at Frogmore, located elsewhere within the grounds of Windsor Castle. This burial ground has been used for other members of the royal family who were not monarchs, and it could potentially be developed to accommodate future kings and queens as well. Whatever solution is ultimately chosen, it will need to balance respect for tradition with practical considerations about space and the changing nature of royal customs. The King George VI Memorial Chapel stands as a testament to Queen Elizabeth II's foresight and her desire to create a dignified resting place for her family. What began as a solution to the problem of her father's temporary burial has become the final resting place for some of the most significant figures in modern British royal history, a quiet chapel where generations of one family are united in death.